There we go. There we go. Are you ready? COC. Why you dealing with the cyber threat when you know you got an era right? Yeah. You are not alone, don't do it by yourself. Get you some defense will help. If you know you won't be cyber free, come and get you some COC. Satisfying controls, lock them access points. We won't disappoint. COC, fight cyber threats. Promise you will not regret. We go deep and penetrate. COC, come and see.
Hey. All right. Welcome back for yet another episode of Crump on Cyber. All right. Today's episode, we're going to go a little backwards to a security control that comes from NIST that obviously then makes its way into this new DoD cybersecurity program called the CMMC. And we're going to go deep like we did on the first time we hit on this control, number SC.L2-3.13.2. It's titled Security Engineering. Now, the last time we hit on this, and it's got some bits and pieces. I'll bring it up here in just a sec, but it's got a number of just kind of bits and pieces to it. It talks about employing architectural designs. That's one element. Software development techniques on the second element, and systems engineering principles, a third element that promote effective information security within organizational systems. So the first time we dug deep, we went into some of that software development techniques, and we looked at some examples of code and environments for using containers. So in this episode, a little bit later on, we're going to have a special guest, Ernie Edmonds, who's going to take us deep into the world of network diagrams, because that's a key element of being able to really kind of talk about or demonstrate, in a visual aspect of what some of these architectural design principles that an organization might have inside of there. Okay, so let me bring up that. I'm going to change the old graphic here a little bit. So as you can see here, we've got the statement itself, and there are 6 what they call objectives, assessment objectives that are tied to this. And the 2 that we're focusing on here is the architectural designs that promote information security are, number 1, identified, and then actually employed. And so that tells you that, hey, I'm gonna expect to kind of see something, right? See something that demonstrates that you've got something identified or defined, and then likely a lower level bit of evidence that shows that, okay, you show me a network diagram, but now you're trying to do something with this network. And well, how do we do things on our network? Well, we use different assets like firewalls and VLANs and other things. And so that means that there's going to be a higher fidelity kind of piece of evidence there. And that would be likely a configuration screenshot. But as we know about these controls, inherently they lean themselves toward 2 of the assessment types of objectives that we out there: examine, interview, test. And the more technical ones do tend to kind of lean themselves toward exam and test. But we're always looking for this concept of adequacy and sufficiency, the right evidence and enough of it. So, yeah, we're going to see, likely multiple kinds of evidence to support this kind of a thing. But this is the one that we're gonna go deep in here. Now, this is talking about, your network, your different kinds of things that you might have as part of your architecture. When we talk about the architecture, though, people kind of, we're talking about, these assets, and those get defined in something called the CMMC scoping guides here. And in here, it begins to also have a conversation about some of these architectural kinds of principles. And here we've got a network diagram of sorts that depicts these different types of assets and different categories. And this is, this is great. I mean, it's great from the perspective of, look, I've got some color coding going on here, right? I've got a legend, and geez, in the world of network diagrams, you got that. It's like you're going to be making some friends fast on the assessment team. You've got some color coding and all that kind of good stuff. But this diagram we see here really is not going to be adequate for any kind of a CMMC assessment. Okay, there's just too much information missing here, too much context missing from this. Okay, so before we bring Ernie on, though, I want to spend a little time just kind of looking a bit more at this topic of these engineering principles, because when you read through this discussion here, it says, hey, we can go take a look at this NIST 800-160-1 and get a bit more context as to, what do we mean by these engineering and engineering principles? So that document, NIST SP 800-160, is titled Developing Cyber Resilient Systems, a Systems Security Engineering Approach. Okay, so you might think you're going to run off and go see all kinds of nifty technical diagrams and that kind of a thing. And that is not what you're going to find at 800-160. Okay, it talks about a framework and goals and these things called objectives and different types of things like that that can be employed. And some of them do have technical elements to them. But yeah, it's not like that. So if you're expecting that kind of guidance, you're not going to find it there. Okay, it talks about the goal of 800-160 is to address security, safety, and resiliency issues from a stakeholder's perspective and protection needs using engineering processes all across the entire SDLC. Right, so all the way from the architecture design element. So it talks about focusing on this cyber resilience engineering, and it positions that as an emerging specialty in the engineering field, and it's applied at this conjunction with resilience engineering and systems security engineering to develop collectively the survivable, trustworthy types of systems. And where we can apply that, where this framework and these elements can be embedded, well, yeah, from architecture, design, development, maintain, and sustain, all the way across there, and across and imparted it within those areas is the ability to anticipate these adverse conditions or attacks and compromises, withstand them, recover from them, or adapt to them. And embodied as part of this framework, it's got these things called cyber resiliency constructs. And in the constructs, you've got your goals, your objectives, and maybe some sub-objectives. You've got a strategic design principle, structural design principles, techniques, implementation approach, solutions, your actual mitigation approaches there, as well as cyber resilience goals where you can anticipate, withstand, recover, and adapt. Also in there, it talks about different objectives and techniques and approaches. And so just really kind of collectively, it's painting this high level kind of a picture about, well, why do we do this? Why do we need this security engineering type of stuff? And says, well, hey, this is really part of a larger risk management strategy that you need to have in play. And so we talked about risk management on one of the previous episodes. And so this is embodied in that. And then so that's the why we do it. The what we do, well, these are these cyber resilience goals and objectives that I just alluded to. And how you do it are the strategic design principles, the structural design principles, and approaches and techniques that are out there. So putting this into actual practice, so we need to really kind of determine which really kind of constructs are most relevant to a particular system. Okay, so that's important. We're going to see lots and lots of systems as part of these CMMC assessments, because one of the overarching really kind of goals and objectives from the DoD perspective here is to really kind of optimize and gain some efficiencies on how they were doing the assessments. Previously they would go by these cage codes by cage codes, really kind of like a contract by contract type of a basis. They said, well, that's just very inefficient. These organizations are likely doing them in a processing environments with lots of different systems in there. So when we got this, discussion about these principles and how they be applied, and the context of these principles can be applied to particular systems, it tells you that, hey, in any given organization that has lots of systems, there's a very good chance that you are going to see some variability in these strategies and these goals and these objectives and the constraints and the practices and how they're being applied here for what they're kind of describing this 800-160. Now, keep in mind that we don't go to we don't really go aren't able to go off to these other controls and somehow to automatically turn them into requirements. That's not what we're doing here. Okay, what we're doing is trying to get an idea of the mind, right, of NIST when they were developing these controls. And if they say, hey, we were kind of, we got these engineering principle kinds of stuff, well, we need to kind of go figure out in their mind what, really kind of what they were thinking about. So that's this framework here. So we talked about this strategy, and starting with the strategy. Well, we have different types of systems, right? We've got our enterprise systems, we've got our shared systems, we've got our common systems, maybe in an IT shared services environment or a internal SOC, security operations center type of a thing. We've got large scale processing systems. We've got system of systems. We've got a whole bunch of different kinds of systems, but listed within 80160, they call out this critical infrastructure system. Okay. And in there, we're talking about these strategies for how we can do these engineering principles. Well, in there, they talk about, hey, the need to, as part of some other things, but redundancy. Okay, well, redundancy isn't really kind of a big part of the CMMC. Availability isn't really one of the major security objectives that they're focused on. So, okay, should you have it? Yes, of course you should. Should you do backups? Yes. Do lots of backups, right? The other element, the other method there is segmentation. So we have segmentation mentioned here. We have segmentation that's called out in the scoping guide as a recommendation that we do these things to really kind of create safe little, cocoons for our sensitive information, and we do that within our networks as well as part of our architectures as well in the system. So when it comes to an organization that's trying to figure out, okay, well, gee, am I really doing this stuff, and that is something an organization needs to do first, because when it comes time for an assessor to come on site, well, they're going to want the similar kind of context. Now, how they're going to get it is going to be a slightly different way, but it's going to materialize in the materials that you produce and provide to them. So we have to kind of, an organization, you kind of ask yourself, okay, do I have the context? Do I understand the programmatic and architectural and operational and the threats that are facing this system? Well, let's hope you do, because you actually do have a requirement for an organizational risk assessment, and you do have requirements for your security controls assessment. So you most certainly should be able to come with some context as you're viewing these sensitive systems that you have in your organization. And how do we identify the baseline? What is the right baseline for the system? Well, that means getting really kind of intimate with your assets and systems themselves. You have to know, well, okay, well, we've got this system here. What does it take for this system to operate effectively? And if there's anything else on there, well, we probably ought to get rid of that. Okay. Let's kind of, we have controls that kind of, talk you down that pathway around shutting down ports and protocols and services and that type of a thing. But you have to be able to kind of gain that context and understand of your assets and the systems themselves before you can do an effective job of doing these self-assessments. Once we've done these self-assessments and going in and adding to this context is, well, we look at the systems themselves and say, well, I've done this assessment. What are these real kind of sources of fragility, these vulnerabilities and weaknesses I've got in them? Well, I should obviously go through and do what I can do to kind of harden those assets. But it also gives you some perspective of the attack surface itself, based upon your assets and how they're configured and what your architecture looks like. So I mentioned segmentation previously, and there are certainly architectural layers at which cyber resiliency principles, some of these things that we talked about here, can be applied. But if we look at segmentation, it talks about having two kinds of segmentation: a predefined segmentation or a dynamic segmentation with isolation. Okay, yeah, those are certain ways, and we're likely going to see some of that stuff here when we get Ernie on the line here in just a bit. But from a technical perspective, where can we see this predetermined segmentation? Where can we see this dynamic segmentation and isolation? Yeah, well, it's all parts of the SDLC, right? So this is talking about we're going to isolate on networking, but these concepts apply to all aspects of that system. So hardware, firmware, networking, communications, your OS, your cloud, virtualization, middleware, and infrastructure. So it's much more encompassing when it's talking about engineering principles. It's your ability as an organization and is to apply those kinds of principles in the proper context. What does apply for any given system. So that's it. So that's really reliable. This reliable and additional context, certainly can play into the security engineering, and there's an expectation that is actually happening. Organizations need to be able to speak to that. What is that strategy? What is that approach? Are we taking? What are these principles behind why and what and how we do the things that we do? All right. So when it comes to, though, very, very, very specific element here, this network diagrams and the things that we should really kind of see there, we know that the one in the scoping guide is not the example that an organization should be looking at. There's got to be something better. So let's bring Ernie on the line here. Ernie?
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
So, Ernie, maybe just take a couple of minutes just to introduce yourself, let folks know a bit about your background and the work that you do.
Sure. Well, I'm a lifelong hacker. Started in the late 70s. Started with just a dial-up modem and grew out of there. Along the way, I've been Deputy CISO at the U.S. Capitol, led the largest 2 deployments of network access control / zero trust in the world with a couple of the largest banks. Was all over DC, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and now I'm with CMTC in sunny Southern California. It's finally sunny. And I help the small to medium manufacturers, mostly small to mediums in California, with their cyber environment. Dozens of certifications. I think it's somewhere around 4 dozen at this point. I'm trying to do the CCP. We talked about that. But yeah, I've been just all over DC and all over the world. I was designing and building data centers back in the .com days, and have always gravitated towards security and the offensive side of that craft.
Brilliant, brilliant. So you've seen a network diagram or 2 in your day, have you?
Yeah, once or twice.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. So we, in the scoping guide's got a very, just high level kind of example in there. And it's funny because I'm already seeing that kind of diagram materialize in customers' documentation. Already, right? It comes across, they're trying to get ready for the CMMC and they looking for help, and they float over their network diagram. And it looks a lot like that. It's like, that's really not going to do it, right? We need more. So maybe you can talk about some of the things that we would generally expect to see, and if you've got some examples, that we certainly love to see those.
Yeah, let me present if I can.
Yeah, great.
Share screen. And let me know when you can see this.
All right. I just need to add it in here.
There we go.
There we go.
So when I click on the slide, you're gonna go away. So I'm not gonna see you when we're talking about this. So that's just where we're at. My name again, Ernie Edmonds. This is what we call security reference architecture. And this model that we're going to talk about today, it comes from a model that I wrote when I was with the federal government almost 20 years ago. So it's ancient by most standards. But the thing about architecture is the architecture should survive the technology. And the engineering is the technology and the configuration and the metrics and so forth. So this architecture has lived very well. And currently we have a number of these architectural models. Some of them are IT centric. Some of them are IT/OT centric. Some involve the cloud, some are on-prem only, but today what we're going to focus on is the Model 6. This one has, and this whole model is designed around the value of the data. So there's a lot of models out there that are based on the role that a particular system or, collection of systems would do, whether they would be general support systems like AD or DNS or something like that, or application centric, SQL Server or SharePoint, whatever it would be. This is based on the value of the data. And yes, there can be roles mixed in there that, make sense, but it's really about protecting data. And in this case, controlled unclassified information. But there's other data that can benefit from this model, whether it would be intellectual property or financial or HR, whatever that would be. It can all benefit from this. And this model is not prescriptive. It can be adapted to whatever you think. We're up to level 9 now when you get operational tech in there. So like ICS SCADA. But you pick the model that works the best for you, and then you build it out from there. Jeffrey, you mentioned a few minutes ago 3.13.2. There's some other intersections. 3.4.7, restrict, disable, or prevent the use of non-essential programs and functions, and that's usually whitelisting of apps, blacklisting of apps, whatever. But the ports and protocols specifically are, something that we're going to look at today. And then we talk about 3.13.2 architectural designs. We are going to eventually get to an architecture. And then 3.13.6, deny network comms traffic by default and allow network comms traffic by exception. So when you're doing these rules in your firewall, you're going to have functional rules at the top, and then at the bottom you're going to have your blanket deny all. And the way I know we've got a mixed group of people, the way a firewall generally will work is top to bottom, left to right, like we read the English language. So if it fits, the web rule 8443 TCP, then yeah, it's going to go and it's going to allow you to go there or to wherever there is. You don't have to open up the entire internet, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Same thing with DNS and NTP. You've got to set the clock. You've got to have DNS. It's good to have a risk remediated DNS. But those are external general support systems, and that's what it is. Anyway, at the bottom, you're going to have that deny all. You're going to have that for each of your respective zone rules, and we'll get into the zones. But each zone will have its own collection of firewall rules. There's also a concept in some firewalls called floating rules. We're not going to necessarily use those, but just know that they exist, but they're not an ideal situation for when we're trying to use a most restrictive / least permissive data flow, which is what's required for the 171 and the CMMC. So the process, we're going to have a decent firewall. If somebody's got a Best Buy special, it's not going to work out for them. Figure out what your pieces are now. When I was a kid, we used to dump out the erector set and see what we could build. So that's kind of what you're going to do now. Determine where stuff exists. Where does your CUI live now? Is it all over the place? Is it on workstations? Is it in databases somewhere or flat file systems like NTFS or whatever? Figure out where this stuff is, and then figure out what a perfect state looks for yourself. This is how you implement this stuff. Pay particular attention to the CUI, intellectual property, anything company sensitive. Then you're going to also look at your general support systems like we talked about. So regular DNS, when it's insecure, it's good to have DNSSEC or some other form of secure DNS. Then there's NTP. You got to set the clock, so make sure everybody's pointing to the same strata there. External support systems, are you using something like third-party Microsoft platforms like OneDrive or Google Drive or something like that, even SharePoint or anything like that? Anything that's an external system, meaning it is not controlled by the organization that you belong to, then it's an external system. Sometimes I see like, well, what if it's the reverse of that? What if we own the system, but we don't actually run the system? That would be where you're like a co-location provider or something like that. Everything goes down to most restrictive, least permissive. Aliases, when we talk about aliases in a firewall context, there are usually things like a host alias, which would be like an IP address, but you can have groups of things like DNS servers. And if you've got two DNS servers, you can put both of those into a single DNS alias. And now it becomes easier to make your firewall rules. And if you've got 500 lines in your firewall rules, by the end of the day of looking at that, you're going to be worn out. So if you can have these aliases, it really helps you when you audit your rules and need to change and things like that. When you start out, delete all the existing rules. A lot of times firewalls will add gratuitous rules just to make it easy. This is not about making it easy. This is about making it right. So delete everything that's there, not your anti-lockout rule, if it'll even let you, but everything else that it creates, delete it. You want to have 0 rules going from zone to zone and, whatever that would mean to you. Determine which roles need to talk to which other roles and provide one-way rules for each needed instance. So if you've got a DC1 and a DC2 and they're in different zones, which is what I'm going to show you very shortly, you're going to need to provide the firewall rules for that communication to take place. And since there's in almost every firewall situation, you don't have two-way rules, you'll need to have a reciprocal one-way rule for that as well, in this case where you've got DC to DC comms. Build it to perfection. Make sure that you sharpen this blade into the razor that it needs to be. Rules. Level hopping is prohibited. We'll get into that in just a minute. Secondly, refer to Rule 1. We talked a little bit about aliases, external GSS aliases, DNS and NTP. So that's not your internal server like your AD server. This is like OpenDNS by Cisco or Quad9 or whatever DNS you're going to use. And those are two risk remediated DNSs that generally work well. Cloudflare also has a solution that generally works well. Same thing with NTP. And then we talked about this concept of not allowing the entire internet to be accessible from your environment. So what I do is a geo block alias is what it's called in my firewall. And what I do is I put it as geo, and there's a drop down. It says geo block, and you can deselect countries. What you want to do is select all and then deselect, because what happens is if you say US only, then people like Cloudflare and Akamai and these distributed content providers, you're going to end up hitting the UK or somewhere and your page isn't going to load right. So what I do is I allow everything. Then I block the Russia, former Soviet blocks. I do block Ukraine at this point because you really don't know who's going to be reaching out or who you're talking to there. Western Samoa, they sold their namespace to the highest bidder a long time ago. And serials.ws is where you can get a serial key, but you will come back with something besides your serial key. Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, any of the terrorist hotspots, communist countries, they still are, not really for the U.S. So North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, Venezuela, there's a bunch of them out there. I do block those. Remember, this is not prescriptive. You make it fit to what your needs are. You may need China. I don't need China, so I would probably put China in my block list. In fact, I know I've got China in my block list. So you figure out what your needs are. Some people need Taiwan, others don't. So, tailor this to where nothing is gratuitous. What happens is your people can't get to China or Russia or, wherever. And likewise, any packets coming from that will be dropped at the interface. So yeah, they can go through proxy. That's always a question that comes up. What if they proxy? Well, yeah, they can go through the proxy. So the logic can touch you. So if it's an advanced attack with a method, then yeah, you can still be susceptible to that, like a 0-day or something like that. But they can't throw the heat to you. So if it's some sort of a distributed DOS attack or something like that, where they're just trying to blind you, it will drop that and it'll protect you against that, even, with the proxy. But out of the gate, everything from those countries, and these IP ranges are dynamic, and that's part of the configuration, is to set it up to where it automatically adjusts. Now you've protected yourself from a whole lot of things that can hurt you. Going into the zones, Jeffrey, feel free to chime in anytime you want. I'm just kind of
you're rocking and rolling. This is great. I'm listening. I'm listening in.
I teach cyber for a couple of the universities, and I just talk for 3 hours straight. So if I say too much, you want to chime in, feel free. So we have this unmanaged zone at the top. This is the internet. I call it the black zone. We also have, you got to have a stoplight in 2023. So there's red, yellow, green. And then there's a white zone that you see over to the left, and then a blue zone over to the right. And then down at the very bottom, you'll see some typical IP schemas that I'll use when I'm standing up a network. So the router firewall gateway, it's always .1. Some people use .254, or, whatever that looks like for the masking that they're using. 2 to 10 is switch and AP. So the IP addresses for the switches, the access points, things like that will be 2 to 10. Active Directory and other Windows addresses are going to be 11 through 20. 21 through 30 is Linux. If I've got like a Pi-hole, or if I'm using something like a Wazoo, depending on how you pronounce it, the SIM, or something like that that's Linux based, then that's the IP address that I will assign that. Print devices 31 through 40. Security cameras and other things are 41 through 50. Unassigned 51 through 100, and 251 through 254 are again unassigned. So my DHCP scope, if I'm using a 23-bit mask, will be 101 through 250, and it should be 101 through 250, not .250. And then of course 255 is my broadcast address in most situations. So when we look at this, yeah, those IP ranges look like they would work, but where do they actually go? Remember that we've got value of the data that comes into play. So what we do next is, this is a different looking legend, but we're going to go with it. So what we've got is, actually, that's not even going to work for us.
I was going to say that reading that left one would be nearly impossible. You'd have to talk through that.
Yeah.
If we're going to get to that
well, we're
level.
going to talk through, just for whatever reason it's not showing up properly. So let's talk about where things go. So the red zone, we have the IoT, things like, the Chromecast, the Roku, Fire TV, Xbox, PlayStation, whatever. I came from a Silicon Valley environment, startup environment, and people.
I was going to say,
they live at work, so they've got the Xbox going. I've had Bitcoin miners. Those things were showing up because I got free electricity. You name it, I've probably seen it. I've been around since forever. And that one, if you notice, I've got the IP space as 10.0/24, so 24-bit mask. So my low would be 10.1, my high would be 255, and the VLAN is 10. I always match my VLANs to my network ID just so it's easier when I'm managing things. But notice out to the next one, you've got a VPN, which is 11.0/24. The reason for that is if somebody's coming into my VPN, then there is a time, especially using legacy technology, that there's things that are going to be in the clear. So if somebody compromises and gets a foothold situation in my IoT environment, I don't want them to be able to see my VPN. The traffic in the VPN. So the VPN is going to uncrack it. And of course, it's going to get DHCP. And then it should, depending on what they're doing, get encrypted to go to RDPN or whatever. But if they're doing something like a file transfer, well, remember, if you're using SMB 2.0 or earlier, even 3.0 that's not encrypted, the payload is sent in the clear. So if somebody were to authenticate, the username sent, and then the hash for the password or the token if it's Kerberos, but that's going to be something where they can't necessarily replay it back. But as I'm sending data, they can sniff that data. It's not too hard if you're on the same subnet to use something like ARP poisoning routing or just ARP poisoning in general, to where you can make your guy the man in the middle. And now all this traffic's going through your guy, and they can exfiltrate that. And now they've got your CUI potentially, or something else. So I separate that. So now I've got 2 red zones, and now I'm going to introduce a third red zone, which is my CUI server. So this is normally a push mechanism from your outside people. If they need to send you CUI, then they'll push that to the server. It'll get virus scan and whatever. Then ultimately it'll go into a more protected repository. Remember, red is unprotected. I didn't say that, but red is unprotected. So that's what lives primarily in red. Your IoT devices, your VPN, and your CUI, but they're in different reds. Remember, the layers are based on the value of the data, but they don't have to be the same zone. In this case, you could have quite a few. It's going to be restricted by really what your firewall can handle. When we go into the yellow zone, this one is, it primarily is a single yellow zone, because the things that go in here are things like organizational Wi-Fi. To that point, red is where you'd put guest Wi-Fi, and it would just go straight to the internet. So as we're talking, I'm going to hopefully make it to where you can see my mouse pointer. Can you see it over there? Shaking around?
Let's see.
It's over VPN right now.
Yeah, I thought it's. Oh, yeah. Okay, there I see.
Okay. Yep, so this thing about no zone hopping, what that means is red can talk to black, black can talk to red. So like your VPN person that's coming in, they are coming from black, they hit the VPN server, and now they land in red. Well, if they get a DHCP offer and they accept in red, then now they can talk to yellow. So yellow is what we call the semi-trusted zone, because it's better than red, but it's not great because it still has access to the internet and things like that. Ideally, a web proxy would be in red, where yellow would talk to the proxy and then go to the web. But if that's something that the business just doesn't want to do, the proxy, then it is acceptable as the one exception to have the yellow zone and the blue zone, because both of these are 2.x's. So you've got 20 and then 25. Those can go straight to the internet, and I'll explain what the difference is there. So, but what can't happen is red can't talk to green. It's hopping over yellow, and black certainly can't talk to yellow or green or one of these other ones, because it's hopping across zones. So by doing it this way, there's 2 things that come into play. The management of the network devices, so the router and things like that. We haven't talked about white, but this 50 zone over here, that is the only place that I expose my management interfaces. They're not accessible through my production zone. So if somebody does get a foothold into red, they can't modify my configurations. They can't get to the administrative console or even to SSH or whatever. Those ports are blocked going to the interface. So they can get over here, but it's going to be very hard for them to get into white. And then if they could get into white, well, they still have to compromise my Windows or whatever directory services that I'm using over here. So it takes multiple independent breaches of security in order to get to green, which is where my stuff is stored, my high value stuff. The reason so in yellow, we have things like workstations. Maybe you've got phones that you allow, or laptops, whatever, mobile devices or mobile computing platforms. Those would go in yellow. The thing that VLAN 25 for is, and this is a newer model, is cloud-based MFA. So if you're using Okta or OneLogin or Duo by Cisco, somebody like that, then you would put that agent over on what I would call DC1 over here in blue to where it can get out to do that authentication scheme. And of course, yellow can still get to that. But what can't get to the internet is the green zone. It can never get to the internet. So yellow can request assets from the green, or blue can talk to green if it's DC to DC like we were talking about. If you're using something like WSUS, Windows Software Update Services, or whatever your update mechanism is, or your antivirus updates, then those need to be structured in blue, because green just can't get that job done. But what green can do is really protect your high value assets. And that's, now you're kind of getting a sight picture for why this topology exists. Now we go back into this, and this just shows you what the roles of the things are. So like over in the white zone, we've got the management interface, the admin workstation, the IDS, IPS, the SIM and stuff like that. IoT in the red, client devices, non-persistent storage go in the yellow. And I'm sorry, this thing didn't render well. But yellow is where you're not going to store anything, but you can access something. So, and then the DC2 would go in green, and then your operations master, your first inside operations master is usually your DC1, and then your MFA agent will go over here in blue. So now we've got stuff positioned, but how can it talk? Blue can talk to blue, red can talk to red, yellow can talk to yellow, green to green, white to white, but they can't talk to each other. So what we have to do is create firewall rules. So there's a legend over to the right. NTP is purple, DNS is orange, W3 web traffic is red. Print, one of the things that comes up often is print devices, like an actual printer. Where do those go? Well, if it has ever printed CUI, or if it ever will print CUI, it goes in green. So what you would do is your yellow workstations would hit your print server in green. And then since the print server, the Windows print server, and the print device itself are in the same zone, then you don't need a rule there, but you would have to have a rule to get from yellow to the DC or to the member server, whatever you're using for file and print services. IDS and SIM, that's blue traffic. SSH is light blue. And then remember, these have to be most restrictive, least permissive. So you say, all right, what needs to have DNS access? Well, I know my firewall needs DNS, so I'm going to allow the firewall to get to the external DNS. I'm going to allow my firewall to also get to external NTP. And then now continuing on the DNS and NTP thread, we know that DC1 and DC2 need to get to both of those, because even though the DC2 can't get to the internet for web traffic, it's going to be servicing DNS requests out of your yellow zone. So it needs to be able to resolve those. So you're going to daisy chain from external DNS to the firewall to the AD and then to the workstation. So, it's going to be filtered. It's also going to put registrations like DNS registrations and so forth in Active Directory. If that's what you want to do, that makes that possible. And then your white zone, it's going to be just management for everything. Remember, your red, yellow, green, and blue do not have access to your firewall interface for like configuration or your switch interfaces or anything like that. So at the end of the day, what this looks like when you get it built out is a bunch of mess. So these arrows are different, but keep in mind, each one of these arrows is a firewall rule. So when we're looking at this, we have to figure out what is the most critical path for success for rule generation and data flow. And this, if you show me, if I'm your auditor, your assessor, because I do 53 audits a lot too for federal systems. So if you show me something like this, and then you've got these rules defined, I'm going to go to your firewall, and you're going to say, no, I'm not going to show you my firewall. And I'm going to say, yeah, you are. And we're going to have that discussion, because you don't want to show me your firewall, because that's really sensitive. So what I'll do is I'll say, all right, bring it up and let me see it. You don't have to give me any paperwork that's going to, I'm going to carry off and potentially compromise, but show me that these rules are in place. So we have this scheme, like we were talking about, or what Jeffrey was talking about in the beginning, that we have the scheme that the rule, we know what to do. We have to make sure that we're doing it, and we have to validate that we're doing it. And that's the assessment part, is to assess that you've successfully implemented. So in this case, you're going to have all these rules based on the color. It's going to show you how these rules are to operate. And then the very last rule, we said it in the beginning, deny all. That's always going to be your last rule in any of these respective zone stacks. It's a rule stack, but it's zone specific, so I'll call it a zone stack. You're always, as the last rule, going to have deny all. And that's really how this model works. Again, this is a model. It's not the only model. There's a bunch of models out there, but this one does lend itself particularly well to what we're talking about today, protection of CUI. And it also supports everything with zero trust that's upcoming. We often call this a trust zone topology. That terminology, although it's been around for nearly 20 years, is confusing because, thank goodness, zero trust is getting some legs now. So we've kind of gone to a protection layer topology naming, but yeah, it supports everything, all the canons tenets that zero trust employees represents, employees, whatever. And you can stand this up now. And this is just a configuration thing in most cases. You don't have to buy anything new. If you have like some dumb switch, then yeah, you might want to buy a managed switch. But if you've got any type of a real firewall, you're going to be able to do this. And what you do is you stand this up in parallel with what you currently have, and then you decide that everything's right. You're going to measure twice, cut once, that analogy, and make sure everything's right. And then some weekends you're going to move everything into its appropriate zone. You are going to clear the DNS. That will cause so many problems if you don't clear the DNS and AD, because it's going to think that all the service records are for the old IP addresses when you've moved zones with like your DCs. So just remember that. But anyway, that's how this works. And so far I've had, I don't know how many, maybe as many as hundreds of clients implement this. It's been implemented a lot of places, like big enterprise that I've worked as well. And I believe the DoD, some of the classrooms at DoD are actually teaching this model now.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. So here we are.
Excellent.
Do we have Q&A? I don't know the format for this. I've got a Q&A.
No. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I wasn't. With when you had the zone, the graphics, the different kind of colors up there, the first thing that kind of jumped to my mind was, it kind of reminds me of the Purdue model kind of a little bit.
Yeah,
there.
Purdue is, in my opinion, Purdue is not as strong because while it does natively capture OT, it does not separate by the value of the data. Yeah. And that's the strength of this model, is protecting that CUI and stuff to the nth degree in that green zone. And some people will even go to a very green. So they have an isolation beyond the green. And so they would use a proxy in green to get to that. And that makes it even a more secure model, because now you have at least filtered traffic, and sometimes you have qualified traffic. And back to the point you were talking about dynamic models, what a lot of people will do is if their IDS or something starts screaming, they'll have the SIM issue through SSH or whatever the method is for their firewall. They'll have it turn off the rules going into green. So green becomes completely isolated. And some of my clients will even go so far as to issue a WMI shutdown, to where if it's a Windows box, they'll just shut down. And that way it protects even further. So at the blink of something going wrong, now you've got isolation, and then you can even shut it down in case something did go through, while you were looking.
Okay. So that's brilliant, right? Love it. I really do love it. But there's the strong likelihood, right, that we're going to see a lot of flat networks. Can you talk a little bit about flat networks, and how do we do with those? Yeah.
So what's worse than a flat network? Two flat networks. I had a client that had two flat networks. Yeah, they had the Windows side and they had the Linux side, and there were two flat networks with multi-home computers. I don't know why, but yeah. So flat networks are everywhere. Like if I ask somebody, what kind of a network do you have? If they don't immediately say something like a multi-zone, blah, 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 it's flat. If they say what, it's, of course it's flat. 99.something% of the networks out there are going to be flat. The problem with that is, I'm from the East Coast. You can probably tell by the accent. But we have these things called row houses. Well, even with a firewall, what happens if one of the row houses catches fire? It burns the block down. Right. Yeah, it burns the whole place down. And that's what you're looking at with a flat network. If one of your devices catches fire, your whole plant's going to burn to the ground. in all likelihood, because if you've got a flat network, you probably don't have adequate monitoring and response availability in real time. And that's back to that rule where the SIM will issue the shutdown. You have a machine speed response to a machine speed actor, which is critical, because these things, you're talking gigahertz processing and really high bandwidth in modern networks. So the likelihood of you responding to even a text message, much less an email or whatever, by the time you get the email, there's half your environment. By the time you read it, the rest of it's burnt down. So having these machine speed responses is critical to success. And then, of course, virtualization, in case something does fall through the cracks, you can just right click, import back.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. So on the, we were kind of talk about the things that we would expect to see in a traditional, really kind of network diagram. And I guess the what you've brought up is, okay, well those diagrams are changing. Okay, they're not necessarily, maybe not what we're used to seeing in for some folks that have gone through some of the more traditional cybersecurity training or network engineering classes, just depending on how long ago it's was on or what they went through it. But what we're looking for, things like the security boundaries, and where does this enclave set within the broader context of the enterprise, the connections to any kind of external systems, wireless, you'd mentioned, any remote access, and you also mentioned DNS, the cloud, things like that. Any guidance on what should they be looking for, best places to kind of make sure that they're getting the right information, because the way that this is supposed to work is the OSCs themselves need to go figure it out first, right? And then they need to come to the assessor making a case for, this is what my scope is. And so the assessor's got to look at that and be able to make heads or tail of what they're seeing.
Right. So what you're going to do, this is going to be the high, I don't want to say high level architectural diagram, because it's not. It can be part of your high level diagram suite, but it's not going to be just inclusive all the way around, because you don't have where are your roles and things like that. Mm-hmm. So this is going to work with your documentation suite. So a high-level diagram could encompass this, but you're also going to have the box in here that says workstations, and you're going to say they're Windows 10 or Windows 11, or these are 10 or 11 or Ubuntu, or whatever they would be. And that's going to be part of your high level. And then it could, like over here, it could say Active Directory, directory services. But then maybe you've got 2 or 3 workstations here. So now you go into your mid-level diagram, and now you've got the box blown out to where you've got the actual servers in there. And then at your low level, you might have configured, you've drilled down again, and now you've got the services running on each box, because they might be the same. One of them could be the master, like the configuration master or something like that, and you'd ID that. And then at the bottom level, you would have data flow diagrams, which, gets into this, but it's going to be more verbose than this. So, this is a higher level thing, and it's not meant to replace a traditional network diagram suite of high, medium, low, and then data flow. So, but talking about the demarcations of boundaries, that internal versus external is going to be this black, and you'd want to identify that, because one of the requirement or one of the practices does say that you'll have it's 3.12.4 that is going to say you've got your internal versus external, and you've got environments of operation and things like that, and how the controls are implemented. So you're going to have, that as well in your SSP. But so here we've got internal and external, but now we've got multiple internal boundaries. And what we can do is target which ones of these are important to protect CUI. So I know that my interfaces for the yellow zone, they're probably going to get to the CUI that's up here in green. But this CUI publishing point, so if I've got file and print services, what's commonly called FPS, that one, I'm going to have a SIM agent for sure right on that interface. So I can detect and I can qualify and I can restrict and I can manage anything that starts looking fishy going into yellow, or it should only be yellow because even blue, it doesn't have workstations. But that allows me to have that interface in green. That is another point that I really need to monitor. It's 3.12.3. I can't remember which one, but it talks about critical internal boundaries or something like that. So external boundaries and key internal boundaries. So yeah, key internal boundary would be this publication point for CUI. And maybe I've got another access point, like a SharePoint, an internal SharePoint or something. So those are key internal boundaries that I would also want to have identified in my documentation suite. And then if I need to go with cloud-based, then I could have something up here. I'm kind of drawing in the right. You can't see it, but see if I can get my mouse over there. So it could be over here, and that could identify my cloud stuff. So if I've got OneDrive, Google Drive, whatever drive, then I can start bringing that into play too. And of course, that would be an external boundary.
Yeah, this is brilliant. What I love about this is it ties together. So the requirement talks about having these engineering principles, and so this is, you could put this in front of somebody and say, well, okay, well, this is how we do it. This is why when the principles behind how we have built this architecture. And then I couple that with the asset inventory, and then the network diagram, and the data flow diagram, and the SSP, and now I'm getting a really, really comprehensive understanding of how you do cybersecurity within the organization. That's what I really like about this, is that it does lay that the principle aspect that we're really kind of looking for here.
Exactly.
Yeah, brilliant. All right. Well, what we'll need to do is we'll need to bring you back, Ernie, for another session, and we will maybe go in and look at some sample network diagrams. So, some of the traditional ones and see the connections and between in the switches and the routers and the VLANs and maybe get some of those in front of the folks so they can have a bit more of a practical view of, okay, now if we got this architecture principle, let's see that thing materialize in a network diagram. And then, can we do something like that?
Totally.
That would be brilliant. Yeah, I think that would be very, very valuable. I think this hit right on the mark with hitting with the principles and the architectural elements that I would expect to see. So it's been great. Arnie, you've been fantastic. Any closing words, any sage advice for anyone out there that's jumping into this space?
Measure twice, cut once. What I see often is people will not have their firewall rules right when they pull the trigger, and something won't work. And then management, the knee jerk, they end up regressing back, and now they've got to explain what happened. And it's a pile of mess is what it comes down to. So yeah, measure twice, cut once. And then, that's really the thing, is just really think this thing through. First principles thinking, as far as, why am I doing this? Is there anything better I can do? Don't combine, always have single principles in mind when you're doing something, so that you don't cause a problem for yourself or something else. And I think those pieces of advice will work well.
All right. Brilliant. Thank you again, Ernie. It's been fantastic having you on. Everyone else, we'll see you tomorrow night. We're going to have, we had a hurricane show that got postponed last week. We're going to have that tomorrow. We're going to talk about the CISO credibility crisis. All right. Everybody else, have a lovely evening. Thank you again, Ernie. Did fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.